Yeah, good morning. Last session we started discussing about enum generics, right? We'll see generics. One point I already explained about generic. Let's go to the project here. Yeah. So one point we already learned about generic. Actually, generic is used for creating type safe members. Generics are used for creating type safe members. One small point I showed you. Now, how you configure generics? One small example we will see. Yesterday already I given you one example, like we have a method which can work for any type. So syntactically, first generic can be defined for properties, so and methods, and for classes you can define properties, methods and classes, and even parameters also. The parameters are generic types. So here constructor will not support generic. That is one point, because generally in generics technologies that support generics, they support constructor also generic type. But here constructor cannot be generic type. So we can create type safe members and we can configure type safe members. Let's implement in one small example and see. Right? Let's see. Here we are defining a type. Suppose I am creating a contract interface, and this contract I given as suppose I Oracle. So it is an interface Oracle, and usually Oracle uses, suppose here it is using server and it is a string type. So, or it uses username, and Oracle uses password, and that is also string type, and database, that is also string type. That means Oracle uses these three to connect with Oracle database. Similarly, suppose we have another contract. This is MySQL, interface MySQL, and this will have host, that is string. It will have like user, that is also string. It will have like password, that is also string, and it will have database, that is also string type. Similarly, suppose I have another interface, that is MongoDB. This will use a simple URL, that is a string type. That's it. That means now we have different contracts. Now generally every database have different connection strings. To connect with the database, they use different connection parameters. Now what we have to do is, we have to create a class. Class name is database. In the database class, we have to create a method. The method public, and the method is connection. This connection method should use a connection string. It should use a connection string. This connection string will connect with the database. Now, this connection method will connect with database by using this connection string. But very important is which database it will connect, that we will decide while working with application. That means every application need not to connect with Oracle. Every application need not to connect with MySQL or MongoDB, different. But we designed only one class and one method. This method should work for everyone. That means this method should work for any type of database. But once you mention that this connection should work for Oracle, then the connection string should be Oracle type. If you tell that connection is MySQL, the connection string should be MySQL type. In that case, now we have to configure them as generic types. That means here generic type is defined by using the literals, this one angle brace with the type, by using the literal type. The T is just T refers to type, and it is formal. Formal means you can give any name. Formal parameters, formal types means you can give any name. It can be anything. So now what we are doing here is we are making this connection work for any type of database, but once it decides the database, the connection string should be only for the database. Then we make this connection as generic type. We make the connection as generic type. And if the connection method is generic type, then the data type of this connection string also of that generic type. That means now the data type, what type of connection string will be decided at the time of using the connection. Now I am writing a simple logic here to read all the connection string, because connection string is an object which contains key and values. I will simply use a for and var property in connection string. We are reading every property in the connection string and we are printing the property here. We are printing the property and we are printing the value of property. Value of property means connection string of property. It will print the value of the property. So this is the connection string and we configured. Now I want to use this to communicate with a specific database. So what we are doing here, I am creating an object, let Oracle is equal to new database. We created an Oracle object. Now this I want to connect with only Oracle. Then through Oracle object, we can access the connection method. Into that, we will pass the connection type as iOracle. That means its type is Oracle. Then it can accept only Oracle connection string. That means now the connection string must be only Oracle. So that means Oracle connection string required some parameters, so which are mandatory. You have to pass all those parameters. If they are optional, you can leave empty. So that means as per the connection string of Oracle, Oracle connection string requires username, password, and database. And we need to pass those values here. That means we need to configure here. So username, because it is an object, username is like some Scott, like a password is like tiger, and the database is like empd, like this. Now we created a connection in this way. Let me keep this just a console.log, and just I will put here connecting with Oracle database. Connecting with Oracle, just I am giving like this. Now I want the same for working for another database. So for example, console.log, and here I define connecting with MySQL. If I am connecting with MySQL, then I will create MySQL as an object for the database class. Through that MySQL, I can access the connection. We can access the connection, and this connection is expecting MySQL type. And in that case, the connection string will be that type. And as per the MySQL connection, it should have a host. So it should have a host. Host is like local host, something like this. And it should have user. User is like some root. It should have password like some 1, 2, 3, 4. It should have database is like some student DB, something like this, student DB, like this. We can configure the connection in this way. So initially the connection is type safe. It is ready to accept any type of value, and once you define the value type, then it will restrict only that type. That is the main concept of generic, means how we can handle generic here. Same, you can try the other option also. Another one is there. I will keep here as connecting with MongoDB, and here I will give as Mongo, and here it will be MongoDB. According to that, this connection string is wrong. Why? Because MongoDB expects only one value, that is a URL, and URL some HTTP colon, not HTTP, MongoDB ://7001:27017, like that. That is the Mongo connection. Usually, when you are creating a method, we can create the method type safe. The method is type safe, and the members are type safe. We can configure the method and the member as a type safe. We can define that. This is one simple point. This is one simple example how we can configure type safe members. I will copy this. So here we created some contracts, and we created a method. So that method is working for different database. I will give one more example so that you can understand in real world where we use them in various situations. For example, let's take another example. This is one situation. Another situation. So I have created a class called data service. I created a class called data service. This data service class is using a method. That means it is having a method public get data. That is the method. Now I want this method to work for any kind of data. That may be products data, employees data, students data. For we don't know what kind of data will come. When you are designing some library and you are expecting data to come from an from API we can have access to various types of data. When we are not sure what type of data will come, but once we know the data type, so we should restrict for only that particular type. For example, suppose we have a contract interface. This is I product type. We have a contract I product type. According to product type, product have a name and product have price. Suppose price, that is number. Only these two I given. Suppose I have another. So I have I employee type. Employee type. This employee type will have first name. So that is a string. So and will have last name, that is also string, and some designation. So that is also string. Now I have to design this method in such a way that it should return any type of data that you are using. Then same concept, we have to mark this. So we have to mark this as generic type. We have to mark this as generic type. So here I am using two options. For example, I am creating get by get data, get one record. That is the option. Get one record. Now it should able to access one record. You can access only one record here. Now that is get one record, and here the type, what is the type here? The data, whatever data comes in, the data will be of that particular type, So we have to read the data and present it. That means we will, because we know one record is coming for var property in data, we have to read console.log. So we have to print the property. We have to print the property, and we have to print the values. We have to print the value. That means here we will define that. So that is data of a property. We are defining that. That is how we are configuring. That means now this is reading all the properties and configuring it. Important is I want to create another that is get multiple, right? Or I will say get all. Get one record and get all. This should return all of them. That means this is expecting a generic type. This is expecting a generic type. Now the point here is, here we are defining the data. This data is also generic type. Now if it is an array, here I am defining like an array type. It is not valid. It is not valid. That means we are expecting multiple records. It is not valid. That means here we are configuring. So suppose this data is multiple. You can see we are configuring here. That means this is expecting what type? It is an array. Here we will mention the type, and here we will mention is it one or multiple. That means you have to just define is it one or multiple. And very important is here when you are configuring the type. So now we know that it is a collection where item of what is it? Data. Because we know that it is an array. And we are using console.log. We are printing the item. That means just I am printing that object. Every object we are printing. Now, technically, when you are dealing with this here, so when you are configuring the type, observe carefully now here. This is the data types and we need to pass. Now I'm using an object LED. So TV is equal to new, what is it? Data service. Through TV, so we can, I will just give as suppose reasonable name as product, okay? And I will give as product dot get one record. Into that, so I will pass here I product type, the data type. That means it is expecting only product type data. It is expecting only the product type data. And we are passing the product type data like name. So name is TV, like we have price. Price is like price. Only this one record we are defining. Now suppose I am accessing here product same dot get all. Get all is expecting same I product type. This time it is expecting an array. It is not one record, it is expecting multiple records. That means you can configure it to return a single, you can configure it to return a multiple. So if it is an array, you know how do we pass array? This is an array of objects. And every object should have a name, like say mobile. So it should have some price and the price. And another object, it should have so the name, some watch, and it should have some price and the price, like this we define. Now we can configure it to return single or we can configure it to return multiple. So you can run, I am not running this, you can run and check this here. Explorer, okay, let's run this. And tsc index.ts and node and index.js, it will print the details. This is printing only one record and this is printing multiple records. It is printing multiple records and this is printing the single record, right? That means we are configuring in such a way that it can handle various types of data. So we can handle various types of data. This is a basic important example. But here one problem is there. Here one important problem is there. The problem is this is the data type. That is an array type. Now what I am doing is I am reading the data. And I am printing. And what I am printing is I am printing all the details. But I want print only name. That means here I am giving item dot name and it says there is no name. I want to print only name and it says that there is no name. There is no name. Obviously there is no name because its type is not known. Its type is not known. If the type is not known, then it says it cannot take that value. It cannot take that value because there is no name under it. Now, very important is name is a member. Name is a member of which contract? Name is a member of product contract. So this type is not mentioned. In that case, we can make this type so it extends. This name can extend, the type can extend, that can extend I product type. It can extend that I product type. I product is an contract. If it is extending the product type, so product type, that means it is a contract. But actually, so we configure like an array or something, it is not allowed. You can see that you are extending, it says that question mark is expected. That means, so question mark is expected. So question mark where expected, null type, this is what type, null type is expected. But actually this question mark why expected, because all these are mandatory, na? All these are mandatory. That means here I am defining optional type, then here we are configuring the optional types. Even you configured that optional type, you can see it is saying that it is expected. So what is that means, I will tell you. Means what is the point, how we can configure that, and when to use these extents, we will see that. Actually, first we will not go that much complex. First I will give you basic point. So here the basic point is we are going to print one type. That means we are going to print these details. That is okay, fine. I will keep this normal and define. And I will copy this example for you so that you can see. Here this is an example of the same. Let's take a simple point to understand how a generic can extend, how we can configure the generic to extend. Because when you are defining the types, data types, or configuring the types, actually here you mentioned one data type and you want to print some only specific details like name. If you want to print only name, here you can see this method is expecting the type, and that type is not known. So that type we have to handle, and we can, suppose I am giving this extends. This extends what type? I product type. This extends the I product type. Then now there is no problem in this name, it can accept. Why? Because generally this generic type can access and use that particular property. So if it is extending that particular contract, generic types cannot use all operators, cannot use all properties. If you want to use the because they don't know the property. If you are trying to use for any specific property, then you have to mention this generic type should be this contract. In this case, for example, now observe here. This time I am creating let emp is equal to new what service? Data service. And here emp dot get one record. Into that I am passing I employee. I am passing I employee. And I am configuring here the employee data type. So employee contains first name, some Raj, and it contains last name, some Kumar, like this. And it contains designation, some developer, something like this I configured. That means it is working configured for this one. And we want to print those details. That means already it is printing the details. Now see here, I will keep a console log, and here I am defining that employee. This is employee information. Here I will put console.log, and this is for product. Just roughly I am separating the options. Now I am compiling this here. I am compiling this TSC, and I am running that node, and you can see it is printing only those. And it is working for both the situations. The generic type is working. The generic type is working for this, and generic type is working for this. Now try here printing all employee details. That means it is of what type? I will add one more option here. EMP, what is it? Get all. And it is I employee. and here we are passing multiple employees. Now you can see that here it is having a first name, and some name, and we have last name. So last name, some last name, and we have one more designation, so manager, and you can see that now it is unable to accept this employee. So why it is unable? Because employee does not satisfy the I product because it is extending. And when it is extending, it can work for only product. That means, can you make the generic type work for only any specific type? Only any specific type instead of working for other types. That you can do if the generic can extend another. Generic can extend another contract or another type, we can do that. That means now if it is extending any contract, it cannot work for this. It cannot work for others. That means we can make it, but it cannot work for others. So technically now this all cannot be used for employees. It can be used only for products. Because you configured the generic type, but this generic type is extending the contract. If it is extending the contract, then it will always work only for that contract. Only for that contract. So, and it will use that particular contract related members. This type of situation you will come across while working with the APIs, services in Angular. There I will detailedly discuss about them. Because for that you need APIs, you need to consume APIs, you need to learn about services. Then you can understand the real process, how it actually works. Because here first we need to just understand what is a generic type and how the generic types are written. But we will really implement this in a concept called services when you are working in Angular. There you will see how we can deal with remote various data types. In that cases, sometimes we need to use the properties in such a way. Actually, I am using product, but generally in real world, what they do is they will use some contracts which are required for all of them. That means any type of data needs that property. In that case, we extend it. That means we don't extend like this. That means, for example, if employee is also having name, am I right? If employee is also having name and product is also having name, that means a common property is there for all the data. Like for example, we have array. Array have properties like length. Length is a property required for any type of data. That means it will return how many characters are present. If any data shares a common property, and that property you want to use through the generics, then you can configure in this. For example, now here, this is extending. So this is first name, okay? This is first name, last name you configured. Suppose it is extending. So I product and comma I employee. It is extending I product and I employee. That means because you learned that you can have multiple inheritance for contracts, but this is not multiple inheritance. This is not multiple inheritance because this is only single. For example, you learned union types. Union types means I product or employee. I product or employee. In that case, this is okay. This is union of types. Union of types. But both should share a common property. Both should share a common property. That means what is the common property? Name. It says that, so for example, here I am defining Here I am defining name. Here I am defining name. That means employee name and all these details. Now you can see it is okay. Now here we don't have first name, right? We have only name. We don't have first name. We have only name. We are defining the details. That means now you see here, I am using another option. So emp dot get all. This is what type? I employee type, and it is an array of employees. That is okay. It will work now. That means when to extend a contract with generic type. Generic type is extended with contracts when we are expecting all the data to have a similar type of properties. If same type of properties are expected for all data, we need same type of manipulation, some same type of properties required. In that case, we need to use this. That means now here I am using name. So some Tom, some say, so last name, some say Hanks. So, and we have designation. Designation is manager, like this. It will work fine. Now all this is fine. That means if you are when to extend, you have to extend when you are expecting the data to handle specific type, specific properties. Generic types don't know the properties, what type of property will come. Then we need to make it extend with the contracts which provides those properties. The contracts that provides the properties. And of course, you can implement multiple because it supports union of type. That means it can be this type or it can be this type. So this is the purpose of extending the generic type. Extending the generic type. This is very complex, very high level interview level questions, very experienced people. This very rarely you will find anybody asking you about extending generics. We don't expect this much knowledge from a fresher level when they are dealing with Angular like technologies. Fresher level, we don't expect. So even at several levels, experienced people also don't have an idea of extending generic. Don't have an idea of extending generic. So, but this is very important and regularly required because generic types cannot work on properties. And if you want any generic type to define and use certain properties, then you have to create the contract and you have to extend the generic with those contracts. Then it can able to handle and use it. That is the point about how we can manage. That means here one important question I will give here. So the frequently asked question. So can we extend generic type? Can we extend generic type? So the answer is yes. Now the question is why to extend generic type? Why to extend generic type? Because generic types are not configured to handle various properties. Understood? Generic types are not configured to handle various properties. So extending generic type allows the type to handle properties. So generally you have to create a custom type. Custom type means your own data type. That means it can be a contract or it can be a class also. Class also can be used as custom type. You can create a contract or you can create a class. So class also used as a custom type, but we don't prefer class to use as a custom type in every situation because class can have some data to implement, right? Some data configured. So we don't want the configured data initialized. We just want only type. So you can create custom. You have to create a custom type and extend the generic and extend the generic. That is how we define. Now in this case here, so example, this is the basic example. I will copy this example. Here we are designing in that. So this example will show how to handle the generics and how do we extend the generic type. Extend the generic type. That is important. So here, this is example for that. I'm just giving all examples to you, right? Another important question asked here is, can a method return type have generic? Can a method return type have generic? So answer is yes. A return type also can be generic. That means not only the method and the parameters, the method return type also can be generic. That's a very common thing. So if method return type is generic, that means what it will return, that is decided by using the parameter that you pass. That means the data type that you pass. That means you can configure the method return type as generic. For example, simple. So if you want to configure method return type generic, so here I kept a class demo. In this class, we have a method. So public and print is a method. It is a generic type method. It is expecting A as generic type parameter, B as generic type parameter, return type also generic. Return type also generic. Now, if return type is generic, then it should return. It should return. And what it should return, I already told you, you cannot have directly operations on this. You cannot have directly operators. That means, for example, A plus B, direct operators are not allowed. If direct operators are not allowed, then what we have to do? We need to configure function. We need to define function. We need to specify the function. So it will take X and Y, and it will return X plus Y. And that it will use here the sum, and it will use A comma B. It will pass those values. Now here very important is let obj is equal to new demo object, and obj dot print, and into that we pass a string, then all are string type, and even the return type also is a string. Return type also string. And if I pass a number into this, that means when you configure a number into this, number, and all are number, and return type also number only. If it is return type number, then you know that you have to print it console.log. We have to print this value because it is returning a number. We have to print the value. So you can configure to define in a particular type. And a method can have a return type also as generic. So it can have return type also generic. Now another important is, can we define a generic class? Can we define a generic class? Answer is yes. You can have a class also generic. Now the question is, why we need a generic class? Why we need a generic class? A class also can be generic. A class also can be generic. If a class is also generic, so class also can be generic. If a class is generic, that means, so why we need a generic class? We want a generic class because we want all the members of that class to behave according to situation. That means entire memory allocated for the class will be generic. For example, here I am creating a class. I am creating a class demo, and this class can be generic. So when you define the class as generic, now in the property, so we have the property. So this is the property. Suppose I just given only property. This property will be that generic type. The property can be that generic type. That means you can use that generic type property. And here, suppose you see here, what is point about this? When you create an object, so let obj is equal to new demo. When you create an object, so at the time of allocating memory for the class, you have to pass the data type. The data type is number type, then automatically it will be so taking all number type values. If you configured as number type, that means obj dot property. This property is what type? It is number. That means once you, at the time of allocating memory, so you mention what type of memory it should handle, and all the members will be defined as that particular type. That means we have a lot of members in the class which need to work for that particular type. It's not necessary. It can have other type also because it's a class. Because it is a class. It's not necessary that a generic class should have all generic properties. Suppose I have non-generic. So non-generic, it is for example a string type. You can have generic members, non-generic members, but in a class certain members are to be generic because they have to handle only the type that is allocated at the time of memory allocation. In that case, we need to use the classes also as generic type. These kind of situations will come in various occasions. Now, this property will be changing according to the situation, but this will be always string. That will be always string. That means we can have certain members in the class. For example, see, I am creating a method here. This method is a generic type. This method is a generic type. And its parameter is also generic type. Now, this method, when you are trying to access, this is number. You can assign some number. I am accessing the method. When you are accessing the method, now this method type is not the number type. You see, by default, it is generic. That means you can make it any type. You can make it a Boolean type, then it will take a Boolean value. That means generally making a class generic will make all its properties generic. So that it can handle all similar type of values. It will not make the method generic. That means that generic methods can be there in a generic class, but those are not according to the class type. They can be custom type. They are not according to the class type. They can be custom type. That means you can keep any kind of value into it. That means I can pass some true, false like this. That means defining a class as generic, will it affect all the members in the class? It will not affect all the members in the class. It will affect only the properties which are of that generic type. That means we want certain members in the class to be of the same type. In that case, we have to configure the class as this type. For example, suppose we have a constructor inside it now. We have a constructor inside it. This constructor is having a parameter. This is generic type. This is generic type. In that case, so if the parameter is generic type, into that we have to pass the parameter. And observe now what the parameter type here. So it is number. Suppose I am passing a string. It is not allowed. It is not allowed. And I am passing here a number. It is allowed. That means constructor type will be determined as the class type. Constructor parameter type and property types will be automatically according to what type you have defined. That means making a class generic will affect two members. What are those? The parameters of constructor and properties. The parameters of constructor and properties. Will it affect the methods? It will not affect the methods. Methods, when you define as generic type, they can be own type. Right? That means making a class generic is to make the constructor parameter generic. Constructor parameter generic. Why to make constructor parameter generic? You know, because at the time of loading the class into memory, I want this to execute automatically. In that case, we have to define inside the construct. So technically, here so many points are there. Why we need a generic class, right? Why we need a generic class? We need a generic class to configure generic type memory for class which will be shared to properties and constructor parameters, which will be shared to the properties and constructor parameters. Right? It will be shared to the properties and constructor parameters. Actually, in other technologies which supports generic, this constructor also can be generic. But here it will not support. Generic constructor. Actually, the technologies which support generics, they support a generic constructor also. But here it will not support the generic constructor. Only the parameter of constructor can be generic. That means you can print that value. Just I am creating the structure to make you understand. Right? That means here when you are configuring, so syntactically like this. This is the basic syntax I will give you. How do we configure the members and how we can define the members? That means the class can be generic, the properties can be generic, constructor parameters can be generic. Generic can be various types. So we have generic properties, generic methods, generic classes, generic constructor members. All these can be generic. So we will use these generics in regular occasions while working with our Angular, right? Here in TypeScript, you should know this is the new thing which it is not there in your JavaScript. What is generic? How do we deal when we need in real world where we use them? All these are important. So one situation I told you, what is difference between any type and generic type? So generally when we use generic type and when we use any type, when we are not sure what type of data is coming, then we go with any type or generic type. But what is difference between any and generic? Any can assign any type of value even after knowing the data type, but generic will restrict to that particular type. That is what actually the concept of generic type, right? This is working with generics in TypeScript, how we can deal and work with the generics. Next, important, I showed you two options, generic with predefined data types, generic with custom type also. If anybody asks, can a generic type can be custom type? Of course, first two examples custom type only. One is Oracle type, one other is MySQL type, another one is product type, another one is employee type. All are custom types. Generic can be custom type or generic can be predefined type. That means you can have a generic number, generic string, generic boolean, or generic can be product type, employee type, anything. They can be custom type or any type. Right? Another very important while working with the classes, you need to know is one important concept, that is dependency injection. Dependency injection. Here we are not discussing the complete dependency injection here. I will just give you the architecture, because to understand dependency injection, you need to learn the technology. You need to work with Angular, then you will come across there. I will just give you class why it needs dependency injection, because later you will implement this in Angular. Everywhere you will see, there you will detailedly learn. So much is there about this point. Actually, dependency injection is nothing but it is a software design pattern. Dependency injection is a software design pattern. So that configures, that defines how an object holds its dependencies. How an object holds its dependencies. So dependency injection is a software design pattern that defines how an object holds its dependencies. I will just explain the architectural point here, but detailedly you will learn about this later. But one point I will tell you here about dependency injection. Actually, why this means, what is this dependency injection required for and how it works? One simple point I will say. Actually, so dependency injection, so it uses a provider. It uses a provider and it uses injector. It uses a provider and injector. Actually, provider is used to locate dependencies. To locate dependencies. Provider is used for locating dependencies. Provider is used for locating dependencies, to locate dependencies. And injector is used to inject the dependencies. Inject the dependencies. Just a basic point you need to understand. Later you will detailedly learn about it. You will work with it. Because this is not the right time to discuss dependency injection, because you haven't learned anything in technology yet. So, but one basic architectural point you need to understand, how it holds the dependencies and how it works. One point I will show you. Actually, see, I will give one small point here. I will create a class called data service. Data service is a class, and this data service class is having a method called get products. Get products is a method. What this get products method is doing, it is returning an array of products. That means it have name and it have price. Name, price, like this it is returning. So this is one object, another object. It is returning an array. That means we have name, mobile, and we have some price. That means we have, so here we have a simple method called get products, which is returning the products. Now I want to use this service in a component. We have a component. we have a component that is called some product component. This product component have to use that service. This product component have to use that service. That means we want this component to use this service and implement and use the functionality here. Now actually there are two types of mechanism how you will inject it into this, how you inject that service into this component so that it can start using it. So in order to do that, here very important is observe carefully. There are two techniques in implementation. Actually, generally what we do is, so we have a data service. Data service is a class. In that we have a method called get products. Get products is a method which is returning some products. We have a method. Now I want to use it in another class. That means in another class we have a component class. Here we want to use it. Now suppose I am creating an object and I am using it. That means I am creating an object for data service. I am creating an object for data service, and through that object I am accessing get products. That means this mechanism is called as single call. This mechanism is called as single call. That means now what happens is it loads this service into memory. It will give access to that method. After that it is finished. You are allocating new memory now. New is dynamic. That means after you finished using that object, that memory is destroyed. But I want this to continue so that I can use the data in so many locations in this component. I want this service to be used in this component until the component ends. I don't want every time to allocate the memory. This is called single call mechanism. In single call mechanism, every time when you need get products, memory is allocated. I don't want memory to be allocated every time. I want memory allocated only once, load into memory and provide any number of times. That means at the time of creating object, it should be loaded into memory and continuously available. Then that mechanism is called as singleton. We call that singleton mechanism. Singleton mechanism means at the time of creating the object, so it is loaded into memory. That means only once an object is created and that object will be available across any number of requests. Object is created only for the first request and the same object will be used across any number of requests. Then this is not the right way. This is not the right way. That means creating an object for this particular class and accessing is not the right way. Then how you do it? I will create a constructor. I will create a constructor here. We will create a constructor, right? We will create a constructor. After creating the constructor, we create a constructor and into this constructor, I am creating data. It is of type data service. I am injecting it. It is of type data service. I am injecting this into it. That means now what happens is at the time of creating object for this component, this service is loaded into memory. But important is you injected into constructor. When you injected into constructor, it will struck in the scope of constructor. It will struck in the scope of constructor. Suppose you see now what I am doing. This data service is having get products now. This is constructor scope. This is constructor scope. Outside that, I will give a method called public print products. That is a method. this print products method have to access this get products and print. That means what I am doing here, I am writing a for loop where item of data dot, you see that data is not available, data dot get products, that data is not available. The data is not available. Data is what type? Data service type. But you injected into the constructor, that means it will be available only to this constructor scope. It is not accessible outside. Understood? It is not accessible outside. But what is the concept of dependency injection is, it should hold the dependencies across any location inside the class and access them. That means now very important here is, it's very simple point here, how I make this data available to this entire class memory. Because you injected into constructor, it is available only to that constructor. Within this constructor only you can use it. But if you want this data to be used in the component memory, then you can mark this as private. Now the data will be available to use. You can mark it as private. You can configure as private. That means now important, what is this private? What is this private? This private indicates that the private indicates that it will be assigned to the memory of class. If it is assigned to the memory of class, how to access the members of class? By using this keyword, na? We have to use this dot data dot get products. It is available. That means it is declared. Remember, if I am not defining this as private, that is not available. Because it is only within the scope of constructor. It is not available outside. That means now I have to make, you can make it public also, anything. You can make public or you can make private. But you know, public means it is accessible to all, but I want it to only work for within the class. If it want to work within the class, then we can make it as a private. Now when I make it private, now this is assigned to the class memory, then we can use anywhere inside the class. Now we are accessing the get data and the products, and here I am printing. So console.log, I am printing item. Item contains data. That means item dot name. I can print item dot price because it's an array. That means I will just print here item dot name and item dot price, that is accessible here. That means this resembles a dependency injection mechanism with a singleton technique. If anybody showed you one second. Yep. If anybody showed you this part of code and asked you what is happening here, why you are creating a private member in a constructor, what is the intention, then what is the concept here? We are trying to implement a singleton mechanism. Singleton mechanism means at the time of creating the object, the memory is allocated and the data is loaded. Once it is loaded, it is available any number of times. You don't need to load every time. You don't need to call every time. That means now see, we create an object. Then how do we create an object for this class? How do we access? Lot of points are there. That is the reason I told you this is only just structure to understand, because this you will implement in later stages when you are working with services and all in Angular. You have to remember this point. So how we can make a member accessible outside the constructor? That means you injected into constructor, then how do we access outside the constructor? To make it accessible outside the constructor, we have to use this mechanism. That means we need to configure as private. If you don't define that, it will be available only inside the scope. That means inside the constructor you can use it, but outside the constructor you cannot access. We need to inject in such a way that it is accessible anywhere in the component. Then this is the mechanism. This you will implement later, not about implementation, just you need to understand the base. Right? Later we will learn detailedly about this in Angular, how dependency injection works, what is provider, injector, and all this. Here, this concept is injecting a service and making the service available across any number of requests. At what time it will inject? At the time of allocating memory. At the time of allocating memory for the class, it will inject and it is available to all. Can we inject multiple? Yes. We can inject multiple. That situation will come later. So currently I'm injecting only one. You can inject multiple into it. So, and we can access and use those members, right? This is the basic architecture, how we can manage, right? Next, important after understanding this, one more, here we have a topic called enums and modules and namespace that we will see next session, right? We have enums, modules, and namespace next session. Next session we'll see on Monday, right? And Monday mostly we will finish TypeScript part, right? And by Monday, Tuesday, we will start Angular. From Tuesday or Wednesday onwards, we will start Angular part. Okay. So from Monday, we will finish this part, TypeScript. And remember, this is enough TypeScript for any level technology. That means even you are learning React or something else, there also this knowledge of TypeScript is enough. And once you start using TypeScript in Angular, you will learn so many more things. Right here, you are learning certain points and some more things you will see of TypeScript while working with the Angular part. Okay, that we'll see in our next session. Monday will continue. Right.